Capitalism demands spiritual bypassing. Have you watched people in your life use spiritual ideas or experiences to pretend that their broken lives or the broken world is somehow okay? Psychologist John Wellwood dubbed this spiritual bypassing, and Liz Buchar just pinged this idea in her recent discussion of Ezra Klein interrupting Ta-Nehisi Coates' history lesson with a Buddhist prayer, because that was a great example. Wellwood died in 2019, and he was one of those boomer psychotherapists who, for the most part, kept therapeutic ideas separate from political ideas. So the notion that people might use bypassing to avoid confronting social cruelty or inequality or their complicity in it, it remained mostly implicit in his work. But those who followed Wellwood made this idea more explicit in their criticisms of things like capitalist Buddhism or instrumental mindfulness, in which corporations fund meditation instruction at work because it's better to have a self-policing and docile workforce. So Wellwood and his inheritors are positing that your spirituality and your experience of the world are two different things, that you can use your spirituality to orient yourself to your material world in positive or negative ways. And that makes sense, and we can see it operating in the difference between how Turning Point USA uses Christianity versus the ministers out protesting ICE and getting shot with pepper balls. It makes sense historically as well when we realize the role Christianity played in authorizing colonialism and sanctifying the hierarchy of bodies and souls that colonizers needed to feel okay about what they were doing. But I want to trouble that line of thinking a bit by smushing those two things together, because here's the problem. If the real world you are using spirituality to avoid is the world of capitalism, that world is itself governed by a bizarre spirituality centered on two interlocking bizarre beliefs. Endless economic growth is possible and mandatory, and individual self-interest will lead to general well-being. Now, in 1921, German Jewish Marxist philosopher Walter Benjamin left a 3-page fragmentary text entitled Capitalism as Religion. One can behold in capitalism, he wrote, a religion. That is to say, capitalism essentially serves to satisfy the same worries, anguish, and disquiet formerly answered by so-called religion. He goes on, capitalism is a pure religious cult, perhaps the most extreme there ever was. Benjamin says that, like a monotheistic religion, capitalism governs all aspects of a person's life, and it seems to be permanent. It takes no days off. It requires that you celebrate it constantly. It structures all life and consciousness. And his phrase, the most extreme cult there ever was, underlines both its success at baptizing the entire planet and making it so hard for us to imagine any way out. Now, decades later, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben took up this theme and ran with it, but he concentrated on the nature of money. His central argument was that when Richard Nixon declared in 1971 that the US dollar would no longer be tethered to the gold standard, capitalism lost its final grounding in material reality and it became purely metaphysical. The banknote that had once claimed to be standing in for a portion of gold or other precious metal now merely claimed to be standing in for another banknote. Agamben underlined this collapse between signifier and signified by saying that it fulfilled an old Christian paradox. The Son does not come from the Father. The Son and the Father are one. So back to Wellwood. His starter pack idea is that people use spirituality to bypass their core psychological or material problems. What I'm adding to this is the idea that if those material problems are embedded in capitalism, it's spiritual bypassing all the way down. In other words, I think we think of spiritual bypassing as the specific tick of religious people who need to improve their critical thinking skills. But if you are agnostic, if you're take it or leave it when it comes to church, and if you're just trying to live a rational, liberal, secular life in capitalism, you are just as religious as anyone has ever been, believing in imaginary things like money, paying obeisance to bankers and economists. If you believe capitalism works or can work, or that it's the only way to be, or that it represents the end of history, you are a disciple of the deep state religion. So what's the point? What's the use of this analysis? For me, it's that whenever we hear a snappy and sensible psychological concept that doesn't have any political weight attached to it, no ballast, and which juxtaposes a fantasy world against a real world, because that's what we get from Wellwood, we should also look carefully at that so-called real world. I think if Wellwood has something to offer, it's that spiritual bypassing is not a function of religion. It's embedded in the dominant order. It's an idea that we can use to look at what we tend to ignore in our everyday lives in general.